The grand halls of Arindravi's royal palace shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Soft blue bioluminescent light seeped from crystalline roots that ran along the walls like veins. The air buzzed faintly, alive with the hum of floating drones maintaining the pristine elegance of the space. Above, translucent domes displayed the endless expanse of stars. Each constellation hung like a jewel on black velvet. Princess Zaira stood at the center of it all, framed by it as if she were part of the design. Her silver-hued skin reflected the soft glow, her deep violet eyes fixed on the endless sky above. She wore the ceremonial robes of her station, their flowing fabrics trailing behind her like rippling water. Despite her regal composure, there was a faint tension in her gaze, the quiet restlessness of someone bound by expectations. Behind her, a pair of heavy footsteps echoed, too sharp, too deliberate. She glanced back, her eyes locking onto him. Commander Ethan Cross. He was a stark contrast to the ethereal beauty of her world. Clad in dark tactical gear, his sharp eyes scanned every entrance, every shadow, his movements precise and purposeful. "You're staring again, Princess," Ethan said without turning his head, his voice steady, unbothered. His gaze remained on the corridor ahead, scanning for potential threats. Zaira tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering on her face. "You are a peculiar creature, human. No elegance, no grace. Yet you walk as if you own every space you enter." "Survival doesn't care about elegance," Ethan replied, glancing at her for a split second. "And if you want to stay alive, you learn to walk like you own it." Zaira's eyes lingered on him longer this time. "And yet, for all that confidence, you remain a servant here. My guardian. My shield." Her voice carried the sharp edge of nobility but lacked true malice. It was a test, a subtle prod. Ethan's lips tugged into a brief smirk. Shields can still choose who they protect. Silence settled between them, comfortable but charged. It was always like this. Words exchanged like moves on a chessboard, probing, testing, learning. Zaira had long grown tired of the careful speech of advisors and nobles. Ethan, however, was different. He was blunt, honest, dangerous. She found it refreshing. Then a flicker, barely noticeable. The hum in the air stuttered, a fractional break in the background drone of the palace's energy systems. Ethan's head tilted, his eyes narrowing like a predator catching the scent of something wrong. His hand moved to his sidearm in one smooth, practiced motion. "Get down," he said quietly, his tone sharper than any shout could be. Zaira didn't argue. She lowered herself behind one of the crystalline columns, her heart quickening. The princess had never seen Ethan like this. His gaze focused, every movement deliberate, calculated. Her world had been full of formality, of ceremony. But this was something primal. The soft click of his weapon's safety echoed louder than it should have. His eyes scanned the entrance hall like a hawk tracking unseen prey. Another flicker of the lights. Another hum of distortion. Zaira's fingers pressed into the cool surface of the crystal column, her breath shallow. "Palace systems are failing," she whispered, her eyes darting around. "That should be impossible. No one can breach our network." "Someone just did," Ethan muttered, his back pressed against the wall as he moved, step by silent step, toward the main entryway. "They're good. Precise. Too precise." His eyes scanned the ceiling, the corners, the cracks, places most wouldn't think to check. "They'll come fast. They'll come hard. We need to move." Zaira stepped out from behind the column, her eyes sharp. "This is my palace, Commander. I know it better than any intruder." "Knowing it ain't enough," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "I've seen too many people die thinking their home made them invincible." He moved to her side, placing himself between her and the entrance. "I'm not letting you be one of them." For a brief moment she studied him, searching his face for something. Doubt, hesitation, fear. She found none. Ethan's eyes were steady, like steel forged in fire. It was the first time she realized he wasn't afraid. Not of her, not of death, not of anything. The door ahead hissed, the sound so soft it could have been a breath. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Zyra's wrist and pulled her down with him as he rolled behind the nearest barricade. The moment they hit the ground, a sharp zrack of energy seared the air where they had just been. Her eyes widened. The heat from the shot had brushed her cheek. "Stay down," Ethan growled. His gaze flicked toward the entrance, tracking the shadows shifting beyond it. 4 figures. Cloaked, fast, synchronized. They moved like trained operatives, weapons drawn. His jaw tightened. "They're professionals. Guards will be here soon," Zyra said, her voice calmer than she felt. "The palace defense systems won't matter if you're dead before they arrive," Ethan finished. His eyes locked on the enemy's approach. He tapped his earpiece, trying to establish a line to the security hub. Nothing but static. His fingers curled into a fist. "They jammed us." The first attacker breached the door, stepping in low, weapon raised. Ethan moved instantly. 2 controlled shots from his sidearm sent a mass. The figure staggered, fell. No sound. No pain, no scream. Implants. Nerve dampeners. Ethan didn't like that. He'd seen soldiers like that before. Soldiers who didn't stop until every nerve was severed. A second attacker rushed forward, faster this time. Ethan met him head-on. No shots, just hands. He ducked under the swing of a baton-like weapon and drove his shoulder into the attacker's chest, slamming him into the wall with a thud. A quick elbow to the faceplate and the figure crumpled. Another shot fired from the doorway. Ethan dove back, his arm outstretched, pulling Zyra behind cover with him. The pulse of energy scorched the wall behind them, leaving a glowing, molten line. 2 left, he muttered, breathing hard. "They're fast, but they're not used to improvisation." Zyra glanced at him, confused. "Improvisation?" Ethan gave her a crooked grin, eyes wild with adrenaline. "They're following a script. I'm about to rewrite it." He reached into one of his pouches and pulled out a small, unassuming cylinder. Zyra recognized it as a thermal countermeasure, primitive by her people's standards, crude human tech. But in Ethan's hands, it was something more. "Close your eyes," he said. She obeyed. A sharp crack followed by an overwhelming flash of white light lit up the entire room. Shouts echoed from the intruders. Ethan moved fast. 3 steps forward, his silhouette a blur. 2 rapid strikes. Grunt, a crash. Silence. When Zyra opened her eyes, Ethan stood at the center of it all. His breathing heavy. His eyes sharper than ever. 3 attackers lay motionless on the floor. The 4th fled back through the entrance. Ethan didn't chase. He didn't have to. "You've won," Zyra said softly, standing slowly, her eyes locked on him. "No," Ethan replied, holstering his weapon. "We're still alive. That's enough for now." His gaze lingered on her, and for the first time, Zyra didn't see a soldier. She saw something more. No titles. No ranks. No chains. Just a man, broken and rebuilt, moving forward with nothing but his will. The distant thrum of the palace's core grew louder as they entered the central control chamber. The walls pulsed with faint streaks of blue energy, like rivers of light flowing through the metal. The air was warmer here, denser, and the faint tang of ionized particles lingered with every breath. Zyra's eyes scanned the room, calculating. Her gaze locked onto the central control console, a circular platform surrounded by holographic displays, each one shifting with streams of data. The palace's entire security system, power grid, and communication network were routed through it. But something was wrong. The displays flickered erratically, flashes of red warnings cutting through the calm blue glow. "They've already breached the core," Zyra muttered, her hands clenching into fists. "This system is supposed to be impenetrable." "Nothing's impenetrable," Ethan replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the perimeter. "People think it is, and that's why they lose." His gaze flickered to a vent above the console, then to the shadows cast by the large power conduits running along the ceiling. "We're not alone." He tapped the side of his visor, activating thermal vision. 3 faint heat signatures lit up the display, crouched low behind the upper conduits. He didn't speak, didn't move. His fingers hovered over his sidearm. Zyra saw it too. Her eyes shifted, focusing on the conduits. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She was learning. Slowly, she knelt, her movements controlled, smooth. Her hands reached for the access panel beside the console. "Keep them looking up," she whispered, her eyes on the screen. "I'll handle the lockout." Ethan glanced at her. Brave. Smart. Risky. He could work with that. He nodded once, then shifted his position, moving like a shadow toward the far side of the room. His eyes tracked the heat signatures as he moved, waiting for that one telltale shift. That moment of hesitation in the enemy's patience came 3 steps later. One of them moved, adjusting their position to follow Ethan's path. Wrong move. He flicked his wrist, releasing a magnetic pulse grenade. It clattered onto the metal floor below the conduits with a sharp clang. They had 1 second to realize their mistake. The grenade detonated with a crackling surge of blue electricity. Sparks erupted from the conduits as the attackers jolted violently, their bodies spasming from the shock. 2 of them dropped from the ceiling, hitting the ground hard. The 3rd attacker leapt down with more control, landing in a crouch. They moved fast, faster than the others. Their stance was sharp, professional. This one was different. Commander, maybe. Their helmeted head tilted toward Ethan, assessing him. Their weapon, a sleek pulse blade, ignited with a soft whum of energy. Finally, Ethan muttered, drawing his combat knife. No sidearm. No distance. This was going to be close. They moved at the same time. Ethan stepped forward low and fast. The attacker lunged, slashing downward. Sparks flew as Ethan parried with his knife, metal meeting energy in a flash of light. They danced across the room, sharp movements, no wasted effort. Every strike, every dodge was precise. Ethan's breathing stayed steady. His eyes locked on his opponent. No panic, no doubt, just control. Zyra worked behind them, her fingers flying across the console's interface. Each input felt heavier than the last. Warnings flashed red, the system resisting her every command. The attackers hadn't just breached the system, they'd restructured it. Firewalls had been rewritten, protocols inverted. Her jaw tightened. Whoever did this wasn't just smart, they were a ghost. "Come on," she hissed, her fingers pressing harder on the panel. Her eyes darted across the cascading error codes, searching for a gap. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. Her mind worked through every possibility, every countermeasure she'd ever studied. The logic was different but not unfamiliar. Improvise. Adapt. She glanced at Ethan, remembering his words. He ducked under a wide swing, sliding low to the ground. His knife shot upward, aiming for the attacker's arm, but they twisted away with impossible speed. They were fast. Too fast. Ethan barely had time to roll to his feet before they came at him again, blade slicing the air inches from his neck. "Not bad," Ethan muttered, wiping a thin cut on his cheek with the back of his hand. "But fast doesn't win fights. Smart does." The attacker said nothing, only adjusted their stance, their breathing eerily calm. Ethan recognized that calm. They'd been through wars too. Another clash. Another spark of energy on metal. Ethan's muscles burned with every strike, every block. The enemy was relentless, and he could feel it in his bones. They weren't here to fight. They were here to kill. "Status, princess," he called out between breaths. "Almost there," she replied, voice strained. Her eyes darted across the console, fingers moving faster. She spotted it, an exposed root command buried beneath a layer of fake protocols. Her eyes widened. They hid it in plain sight. She tapped it twice, and the interface shifted. The warnings cleared, and the system asked for one thing. Override key required. Her heart sank. Her fingers hovered over the input. The override key. Only her father, the king, had it. It wasn't something she could just bypass. But something clicked in her mind. Her father's words from years ago echoed back to her. You'll never need it, but if you ever do, remember what only we know. Her eyes widened. Course. Her hands hovered over the panel, entering a code. Each press felt like a gamble. The final keystroke echoed louder than it should have. Access granted. Ethan, she called out, eyes locked on the screen, get clear. He didn't question it. He broke away from the attacker, retreating fast. The enemy started to pursue, but Zyra's fingers tapped one final command. Purge protocol engaged. A deep, resonating hum filled the chamber. The blue glow of the walls shifted to red. Static charged the air. The hum grew into a roar. The attacker stopped, looking around in confusion, their body tense. Ethan knew what was coming. He grabbed the closest support beam, bracing himself. Pulse. Not sound. Not light. Pure energy. It rippled from the core, expanding outward in a shockwave that vibrated through every surface. The attacker's body jerked violently, limbs locking up as the pulse hit them. Their pulse blade flickered out. They dropped to their knees, head slumping forward. Silence. The hum subsided. The red glow faded, replaced by the familiar cool blue light of the palace's energy flow. Zyra slumped against the console, breathing hard, sweat lining her brow. Her fingers still hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. Not bad, Ethan said, his voice low, controlled. He stepped toward her, wiping the blood from his cheek. He glanced at the downed attacker, his eyes lingering on them for a moment before turning back to her. Smart move. Zyra gave a small, tired smile. Improvise, right? He chuckled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. Improvise. They both looked at the attacker still kneeling on the floor, unmoving. The faint rise and fall of their chest was the only sign they were still alive. Ethan crouched next to them, lifting their visor. His eyes narrowed.